Hey guys, tonight we open a quiet door into a story that seems like the gentlest among the 6 marriages of Henry VIII, yet secretly carries the deepest shadows. It is the story of Jane Seymour, a woman without the dazzling beauty of Anne Boleyn, without the sharp political power of Catherine of Aragon, yet the only one who made Henry slow down, soften, and truly grieve. A woman who almost disappeared from historical records, but whose name is tied to the birth of Edward VI, to the deepest anxieties of the Tudor dynasty, and to a question very few dare to ask. How did someone so unremarkable become the most important person in the life of the most powerful king in England? Tonight, we will step into that quiet, dim space where Jane's gentle choices shifted the direction of the entire Tudor line. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before the story begins, to pull us in slowly, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you live? Someone might be listening in the stillness of night in Arizona, someone else may have just set their phone down at sunset in Boston, and you right now are here, about to walk into this journey with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Jane Seymour, the woman who gave Henry VIII the son he had longed for across so many weary years, remains one of the most mysterious figures in English royal history. Her name is tied to the birth of a future king, to the softest chapter of Henry's turbulent marriages, and yet the truth of her life feels pale, like a portrait whose colours have slowly dissolved with time. What survives are fragments, gentle outlines of a quiet girl born at the dawn of the 16th century, most likely around the year 1508, at Wolf Hall, a modest yet comfortable estate nestled in the green folds of Wiltshire. Her father, Sir John Seymour, and her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, did not belong to the upper nobility. They were part of England's well-established gentry, families close enough to power to feel its warmth, but never quite close enough to touch the crown. Their world revolved around land, responsibility, loyalty to the throne, and the kind of quiet status that made a family both respected and useful. Jane grew up in a house alive with children, 10 in all but 4 of them. Never reached adulthood, likely taken by the waves of illness that swept through Tudor England with cruel regularity. Among her surviving siblings, 2 brothers would later rise to prominence under the Tudor court. Edward Seymour, who would become Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector during the reign of Edward VI, and Thomas Seymour, whose ambition and charm would lead him toward a far darker fate. Her sisters, Elizabeth and Dorothy, secured respectable marriages within the gentry and lower nobility. It was a family shaped by duty, by expectation, and by the steady climb of social aspiration. Unlike Henry VIII's first 2 queens, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn Jane did not receive a sophisticated humanist education. She was not trained in languages or philosophy. She read enough to manage household responsibilities, but could not write beyond her own name. Her parents gave her the kind of upbringing expected for a gentry daughter, whose main future role would be to marry well, produce heirs, and help manage an estate. She learned to ride, to oversee domestic affairs, to supervise servants, and most importantly to sew. Sewing became her single, remarkable skill. Her needlework was so admired that examples of her embroidery were still referenced as late as the year 1652, long after her brief life had ended. Yet even without great learning, Jane absorbed something far more powerful, the careful discipline of duty, gentleness, and silence. When she reached her teenage years, she was sent to court to serve as a maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen. Under Catherine's guidance, steady, devout, dignified, Jane observed what a queen should be: patient, composed, capable of enduring storms without ever raising her voice. These quiet lessons shaped Jane far more deeply than any classical education ever could. They wrapped around her like soft threads, forming the calm, careful nature that would one day pull Henry VIII toward her. Jane likely witnessed Catherine's decline, the slow unravelling of a marriage once built on respect. She may have stood in rooms where whispers of annulment drifted like cold draughts, and she may have seen Anne Boleyn arrive, rise, and glitter sharp, bright, irresistible. For a time, both she and Anne would have stood in the same chambers, served in the same courtly rituals, observed one another's gestures, silences, and ambitions, though the records do not tell us what either woman thought of the other. But what we do know is this: Jane carried herself gently. She learned to appear modest even when ambition stirred inside her. She watched. She listened. She kept her head bowed at the right moments, her voice soft, her presence unobtrusive. Even as a young woman, she moved with the kind of quietness that suited Tudor court life far better than beauty or brilliance. And it was this quietness, this stillness, like deep water, that would one day make her stand out. Yet in these early years, Jane Seymour was simply a daughter of the gentry, living in the shadow of great people and great events, not yet aware that the path laid before her would lead directly to the throne and into the heart of a king who had broken 2 women before her. At the court of Henry VIII, where every glance carried weight and every whisper curled like smoke, Jane Seymour first existed only as a faint silhouette beside brighter, louder figures. When Catherine of Aragon was pushed aside and Anne Boleyn rose to the throne, Jane continued in her modest role within the new queen's household, quiet and compliant, neither favoured nor feared. She had once supported Catherine, but she understood, in a way that only the truly observant can, that steadfast loyalty did not always lift a family upward in Tudor England. It could, instead, freeze them in place. So Jane watched. Day after day, she moved through the palace corridors like a soft shadow, absorbing the rhythms of a court that throbbed with tension, ambition, flirtation, and fear. Anne Boleyn's presence filled every hall, sharp laughter echoing under carved ceilings, French phrases slipping like silk through conversations, sudden bursts of wit that left courtiers blinking. Beside such brilliance, Jane seemed almost invisible. But invisibility, in a place like this, was its own kind of power. While Anne duelled with words, Jane listened. While Anne argued passionately about matters of faith, politics, or etiquette, Jane lowered her gaze and remained still. There was something soothing in that stillness, something that drew the eye not because it demanded attention, but because it refused to fight for it. And slowly, that stillness became impossible to ignore. Jane and Anne were not intimate friends, but they served in the same rooms, exchanged the same ceremonial courtesies, and measured each other with the quiet accuracy of women forced into close orbit. Jane also felt a gentle affection for Princess Mary, the girl who had once been England's hope, and had now been pushed to the side, stripped of her title, and forced to live in humiliating uncertainty. Jane's sympathy for Mary would one day become one of the most defining gestures of her queenship, but for now it lived in silence, tucked between careful curtsies and respectful greetings. When Anne became queen, and Jane officially joined her household, she continued to walk the thin line between obedience and invisibility. She served without complaint, spoke only when necessary, and never allowed her presence to compete with the queen's. If Anne was fire, Jane made herself water-soft, yielding, and calm. But by the early months of the year 1535, the atmosphere around Henry and Anne had curdled. Their early passion had decayed into sharp words, bitter quarrels, and uneasy silences that rippled through every chamber. Courtiers had begun to anticipate storms before they arrived. Even musicians fell quiet sooner, sensing the heaviness that settled over the king's moods. And in that quiet heaviness, Henry's gaze began to wander. In the 9th month of that same year, Henry travelled to Wolf Hall, the Seymour family estate. It was the kind of visit that could be explained away as a royal progress, a gesture of courtesy toward loyal subjects. Yet everyone understood that Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour, both climbing in influence, would not waste a moment of such an opportunity. And everyone understood that a king in a troubled marriage did not travel without purpose. What passed between Henry and Jane in those days cannot be captured in any surviving letter. But the court felt their shift, felt it the way one feels a change in the weather. Jane, with her lowered eyes and quiet voice, became the embodiment of everything Anne was not. Steady, simple, obedient, demure. Henry, exhausted by years of conflict, stepped toward her gentleness as though it were a refuge. For a man who had once chased brilliance, he now longed for peace. Jane did not offer flirtation. She did not offer laughter. She did not speak boldly, nor did she challenge him. Instead, she offered something far more dangerous: calm. And for Henry, who lived inside a storm of his own making, calm felt like salvation. From the moment he returned to court, whispers spread like wind through the privy chambers. Something had changed, something irreversible. Jane Seymour, who could barely write more than her signature, now stood at the threshold of destiny. In the vast, jewelled machinery of Tudor politics, the quietest woman in the room had begun to alter the balance. And whether she wished it or not, her stillness had placed her in the direct path of a king whose choices reshaped the fate of nations. The court would never be quiet again. When Henry VIII first began to turn his gaze toward Jane Seymour, the shift was quiet, almost imperceptible, like a soft current moving beneath still water. Yet beneath that gentleness lay something far deeper, far older, a memory shaped in childhood, a longing that had followed him from the day his mother died. In Jane's calm eyes and modest posture, Henry thought he saw Elizabeth of York reborn, serene, patient, loyal, untouched by the storms of courtly ambition. It was a vision that wrapped itself around his mind with a tenderness he had not felt in many years, and the very contrast between Jane and Anne Boleyn made the pull irresistible. Anne, brilliant and sharp, was a blaze that had once thrilled him but now scorched him. Her wit, her temper, her unyielding spirit, those things had drawn him in when he needed rebellion, but now they pressed upon him like a weight. Their marriage, once charged with electricity, had become a battlefield of expectations, disappointments, and the silent terror that no son would ever be born of it. Each argument echoed too loudly. Each disagreement carved another crack into a union already strained by the demands of a king who imagined himself cursed. Jane, however, entered like a breeze, slipping through a window left open in desperation. She listened more than she spoke. She bowed her head where Anne raised her voice. She moved with care, with softness, as though she had been born to soothe rather than to challenge. Henry convinced himself that this was not mere personality, it was divine correction, God's whisper tugging him toward a woman moulded in the gentle image of the mother he had lost long ago. Those who despised Anne saw it too. Courtiers with quiet grudges, nobles wounded by Anne's arrogance, clergymen suspicious of her reformist leanings. They all recognized the opportunity shimmering around Jane like a veil. And the Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas, did not waste a moment. They guided their sister's steps, ensuring she was always seen but never too bold, always modest but never invisible, every word measured, every gesture deliberate, every glance rehearsed just enough to look natural. When Henry began to send Jane small gifts, the game changed. Others might have accepted them eagerly, but Jane, coached, or instinctive, it hardly mattered, responded with holy restraint. The moment Henry offered her money, she sank to her knees, returning the envelope with trembling hands and eyes lowered. She said she could not accept such generosity unless God had willed her to be his lawful wife. It struck Henry like a revelation. Where others would have reached for what he offered, Jane withdrew. Where others would have clung to him, she stepped back. And in that distance, Henry felt an ache he had not known since boyhood, the ache of wanting something he was not immediately allowed to have. He built an image of her in his mind, pure, untouched, obedient, virtuous. Plain Jane faded like a rumour. In her place rose Jane the chosen, Jane the quiet salvation. Meanwhile Anne's world narrowed. Her inability to produce a male heir became a drumbeat of anxiety. Every miscarriage struck her like a curse. Every cold glance from Henry pierced deeper. And with each passing day, Jane's soft presence grew louder in contrast. The promise of peace, standing beside the chaos Henry believed Anne had brought into his life. Anne felt the walls closing in. Henry felt God urging him forward. And Jane, silent, careful Jane, stood at the centre of a gathering storm she had helped summon, even if her hands appeared perfectly clean. From here, the path toward Anne Boleyn's downfall widened, like a road cleared by fate itself. Henry had begun to dream of a different queen, a different life, a different legacy. And once Henry VIII began to dream, the rest of England had no choice but to follow or be swept away. At the beginning of the year, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, and only a few days later, Anne suffered a miscarriage, losing the child believed to be a son. These two events struck at the very centre of Anne's fragile position. Catherine was no longer alive to complicate Henry's conscience, and Anne had failed in the one duty that mattered more than all others. With those two blows, the winds of the Tudor court turned sharply, coldly, and without mercy. Jane Seymour was brought quietly into a house in London, served by attendants from the king's own household, a silent proclamation that Henry had removed her from the shadow of Anne and placed her firmly within his own reach. Meanwhile, Anne, surrounded by suspicion, cut off from sympathy, and watched by enemies eager to rise upon her fall, found herself wandering through a tightening labyrinth. Each day narrowed around her, each whisper grew sharper, each silence more dangerous. The charges that rose against Anne, adultery, incest, treason, were built on sand. Yet they did not need to be solid, they only needed to serve the moment. The court was exhausted by her fire. Henry was exhausted by her defiance. And so the machinery of Tudor justice, swift and implacable, began its descent. Anne was arrested, taken to the Tower of London, and left to wait beneath the heavy sky of May. On the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn walked up the scaffold, bowed her head beneath the pale morning light, and met the blade of a French executioner. The crowd watched in stillness. The sword rose, flashed once, and the second Queen of Henry VIII was gone. Henry, at that moment, was out hunting. And when word reached him that Anne was dead, he did not linger in solemnity or wear the colour of mourning. He stepped onto a barge and travelled upriver to meet Jane Seymour. No grieving period, no pause between endings and beginnings. In Henry's mind, this was not cruelty, but correction, a divine course set right again. One day after Anne's death, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. 10 days later, on the 30th of May, they were married at Whitehall. The speed of it stretched belief even among seasoned courtiers. But to Henry, everything felt inevitable. Catherine was gone. Anne was gone. The path was clear. A new queen, a new hope, a new chance for the coveted male heir. Jane stepped into her new role without hesitation. She did not look back at the woman whose place she now occupied. She did not tremble at the storm that had carried her forward. She moved softly, deliberately, with the same gentle composure that had first captured Henry's attention. In the corridors of Whitehall, she became a presence both quiet and unmistakable. The image of the obedient, serene queen Henry believed heaven had always intended for him. Within mere days, the Tudor world had been remade. One queen erased, one queen enthroned, one future extinguished, another growing quietly in its place. And through the marble halls and tapestried chambers, a truth hummed low and steady. This was Henry's realm, shaped entirely by his wants and fears, his longing and impatience. In the slipstream of those 11 days, Jane Seymour became the still point around which the king's desires turned the woman he believed could soothe the unrest in his heart, restore order to his reign, and, perhaps at last, give him the son he had chased through so many years and through the lives of 2 queens before her. As queen, Jane Seymour chose a path entirely opposite to Anne. She lived quietly, spoke softly, and obeyed Henry without a trace of resistance. Where Anne had argued, Jane yielded. Where Anne had dazzled in French fashion, Jane dressed with simplicity. Where Anne had reached for influence, Jane stepped back into the shadows. Yet beneath all that softness, Jane carried a gentleness that was real, especially toward Mary, the daughter Henry had pushed aside for so many years. Jane used her new place not to gain power, but to mend what had been broken, and for that the people loved her. But Jane's life was far from peaceful. Henry, volatile and easily enraged, often shifted moods like a storm sweeping across the sea. When Jane once tried to plead for mercy for those who rose against him, he turned on her with ice in his voice. Remember the fate of Anne. In that instant, Jane understood. Gentleness was not protection. Kindness was not a shield. Still, she held her quiet resolve and poured all her strength into the task that mattered most, giving Henry a son. At the beginning of the year 1537, Jane became pregnant. Henry was a whirlwind of joy and fear, desperate for the child to survive, terrified of losing yet another hope. Jane was cared for with extreme caution, sheltered in the calm, guarded halls of Hampton Court. And on the 12th day of October, after 3 days and 3 nights of agony, Jane brought a son into the world. Prince Edward, the longed-for heir Henry, had chased through half his life. England erupted in celebration. Henry glowed with triumph. Jane lay exhausted, her strength slipping silently away. And though the future was already tightening around her, though fate had begun to move toward its final sorrowful shape, the gentle queen did not yet see the shadow falling at her bedside. The birth of Prince Edward was the brightest moment of Jane Seymour's life, and the greatest burst of triumph Henry VIII had felt in many long years. The infant prince, fair-haired and robust, was hailed as living proof that Henry had at last been blessed by heaven, that the Tudor line, fragile for so long, finally possessed a lawful male heir. Across England, celebrations rose like a tide. Church bells rang through misty mornings, bonfires glowed along village roads, cups overflowed in taverns, and prayers of thanksgiving murmured in every corner of the kingdom. To Henry, it felt as though destiny had finally bent in his favour. To the people, it felt like the promise of stability after decades of turmoil. Yet behind the roaring joy of the nation, behind the carved doors of the Queen's private chambers, Jane lay in a silence that no one wished to acknowledge. 3 days and 3 nights of relentless labour had drained her to the bone. She could hardly lift her head. Her body trembled with even the smallest movement. Servants tiptoed around her. Physicians whispered in low voices. Everyone told one another that exhaustion was natural, that recovery would come, that a queen who had delivered a prince simply needed rest. But beneath those reassurances, a quiet fear fluttered its wings. 3 days after the christening, a lavish ceremony held in the chapel at Hampton Court, with long trains of velvet, silver basins of holy water, and the proud half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, carrying the infant's robes, Jane remained confined to her bed. The room smelled faintly of herbs and beeswax candles, all meant to soothe and purify. But her face had grown pale, and the faint fever that touched her skin troubled those who watched her. She complained of a dull ache behind her eyes, a weakness that crept along her limbs, a nausea that came and went, like a shadow passing across the floor. The royal physicians insisted it was ordinary postpartum strain, a lingering effect of a difficult birth. They spoke with confidence, but looked at one another with unease. On the 18th day of October, the Queen rallied. Her fever dipped. She smiled gently at those who entered the room. She held a cup with more steadiness than she had in days. Courtiers whispered excitedly that the worst had passed. Servants cried soft tears of relief. Members of the council sent messages throughout the palace saying that the Queen's health was improving. For a brief, trembling moment, hope filled every corner of Hampton Court. But that night, just as candles were being snuffed and the palace had settled into its soft autumn quiet, the fever surged back with a violence that broke all illusions of recovery. Jane's pulse quickened. Her skin burned. Her breaths grew shallow. The physicians were summoned again, their faces stern, their hands trembling slightly as they worked. They spoke now not of exhaustion, but of infection. They prescribed remedies, warm compresses, potions of herbs, whispered prayers, but the truth pressed upon them like a weight they dared not voice. Women who laboured for 3 days and 3 nights often did not live long afterward. While panic grew quietly in the Queen's chamber, Henry remained elsewhere in the palace, lost in the glow of fatherhood. He spent hours gazing at the tiny prince, the boy he believed was the answer to every prayer he had ever uttered. To Henry, Edward was more than a child. He was vindication, proof that heaven approved of him, evidence that the break with Rome, the fall of Catherine, the execution of Anne, all the upheaval and bloodshed had been necessary, had been righteous, had been part of God's design. And so the king walked the halls with a rare softness in his expression, speaking to courtiers with unexpected warmth, planning festivities for the child's future. He did not know, not yet, that the woman who had delivered this long-sought miracle was slipping further from life with every hour. In Jane's chamber, the fever raged. Servants wiped her brow with trembling hands. Priests stood near the doorway, uneasy. Her breaths came thinner, weaker, like threads stretched close to breaking. The night passed slowly, heavily, the way nights do when those present know they are witnessing a quiet tragedy unfold. Henry, wrapped in joy, still believed the Queen was resting. He did not understand, could not yet imagine, that even as England celebrated the future, the gentle woman who had secured it was drifting steadily, silently, into the shadows gathering at the edge of dawn. In the days that followed, Jane Seymour did not recover as everyone had hoped. Her fever surged again, burning high and unrelenting. Her breathing grew shallow and frantic, her body trembling as though caught between this world and another. She spoke in fragmented whispers, drifting in and out of lucidity, her words dissolving into confusion. The royal physicians, who had clung to optimism, now faced the truth they had tried to avoid. Jane was showing the unmistakable signs of postpartum infection, a condition for which the 16th century had no true remedy. Henry, a man who avoided death as though it carried a personal curse, could no longer look away. He stepped out of the warm, candlelit nursery, where Prince Edward slept peacefully, and walked through the corridors into the dim, suffocating chamber where the Queen lay fading. The smell of crushed herbs, sweat, and fear clung heavily to the air. The curtains were drawn tight. The servants moved like shadows. And on the great bed, Jane struggled to open her eyes, fought to lift her hand, tried for one last moment to reach Henry. But her strength, like autumn leaves loosened from their branches, slipped away with every passing hour. It was said that Henry sat beside her for a long time, silent and still, speaking no commands, voicing no fury, a rare sight in a reign defined by his temper. For the first time in many years, he was simply a man watching someone he truly cared for recede beyond his reach. The weight of that realization pressed against him with a force he could not fight. On the 23rd day of October, Jane's delirium deepened. She murmured soft, broken phrases, as if calling out to someone far away. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Her hands twitched weakly against the twisted linens. Those who kept vigil around her bed exchanged glances filled with dread, knowing the moment was approaching when there would be nothing left for them to do but wait. And then came the dawn of the 24th day of October, in the year 1537. The sky outside the windows paled toward morning as nurses gathered quietly at Jane's bedside. The priest stood near, murmuring the final prayers. Henry remained nearby, towering, immovable, yet utterly helpless. Jane's breaths grew thinner, softer, spaced farther apart, until at last they ceased altogether, fading into the stillness of the chamber. Jane Seymour exhaled for the final time, just as the first faint light touched the horizon. The room fell into perfect silence. No celebration, no bells, no torches blazing in the night. Only a soft, collective sorrow, the kind that settles heavy and unmoving over everyone present. The courtiers bowed their heads. The nurses wept quietly. Even the priest paused, as though struck by the gentleness of the Queen's passing. They all understood they had witnessed the death of the only wife Henry had never turned against. As he always did when confronted by death, Henry left the chamber that very morning. He could not bear the suffocating air of grief, could not bear the sight of stillness where life had once lived. He rode away into the cold, brittle light of late October, a man who had toppled wives, defied popes, and reshaped a kingdom, and yet could not command the life of the woman who had given him everything he ever wanted. Jane was gone, and Henry, for all his power, could do nothing but walk away from the quiet, irreversible truth of her absence. Immediately after Jane's death, the court began the solemn preparations for her royal funeral. Her body was embalmed according to the strict rites reserved for a Queen of England. Her entrails were buried in the chapel at Hampton Court, while her remains were dressed in a gown of shimmering gold, a crown placed upon her still brow, jewels arranged across her chest and hands, as though she were merely sleeping, ready to rise for some grand ceremony in the next breath. Henry did not come to see her. He remained locked inside his private chambers, hidden from courtiers and servants alike. For a man who feared death more than any earthly enemy, the death of Jane, the one wife he had never grown to hate, was a wound he could not bear to look at. Those who passed the king's door heard nothing. No commands, no rage, only silence, heavy and unbroken. On the 12th day of November, in the year 1537, Jane Seymour's funeral procession began its slow journey toward Windsor. The carriage that carried her coffin was draped entirely in black cloth, swaying gently as it moved through the mist-laced roads. Behind it walked Mary the Princess, who had once been cast aside, humiliated, and nearly broken now, bearing a torch as the chief mourner, honouring the woman who had restored her place in her father's heart. The procession felt endless. Long lines of attendants moved with hushed steps. Bells tolled in steady, mournful rhythm. Nobles bowed their heads. Commoners gathered along the roadside, whispering prayers or crossing themselves as the cortege passed. It was as though all of England inhaled and exhaled together in one long, sorrowful sigh, bidding farewell to the Queen, who had brought stability, reconciliation, and at last a son to the Tudor line. Within street, George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, Jane was laid to rest with all the dignity of a beloved queen. Torches flickered against stone pillars. The choir sang slow, aching hymns that drifted upward into the vaulted ceiling. Mary stood near the coffin, her face pale, her eyes lowered, her torch trembling slightly in her hand. Courtiers later wrote that the air inside the chapel felt full of winter, though no wind touched the room. Henry was not present, but from afar he issued one order, one that revealed more truth than any gesture he might have made in person. "When I die, bury me beside Jane." It was the only promise Henry VIII ever kept without wavering. Years later, after 4 more marriages that never reached the warmth or quiet steadiness Jane had given him, after kingdoms rose and fell within his own mind, after his body broke under illness and age, Henry kept his word. He was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the queen who had given him the son he had chased across decades, the woman whose memory remained untouched by anger, and the only wife he ever chose to share eternity with. And so, in the cold stone of Windsor, Henry and Jane lie side by side, a king shaped by storms, and the gentle queen whose light he lost too soon. Jane Seymour served as queen for less than 2 full years, a brief, almost delicate span of time, faint as a breath on glass. Yet her legacy stands more defined, more enduring, than that of any other wife of Henry VIII. In that short window, she accomplished what none before her had achieved, and what none after her would truly replicate. She restored Princess Mary, the daughter cast aside, humiliated, and declared illegitimate to her father's favour, paving the way for the young woman who would one day become Mary I. She helped steady the royal status of Elizabeth, ensuring that Henry's second daughter was not erased from memory or succession. She elevated the Seymour family, lifting her brothers Edward and Thomas into positions of immense influence. And, above all, she gave birth to Edward VI, the long-awaited heir whose existence secured the Tudor dynasty at its most fragile moment. Henry called Jane his only true wife, the one woman he truly loved. And though such words came from a man whose affections shifted like the tides, there was a measure of truth in them. Jane was the only wife who did not threaten Henry's authority, the only wife whose presence did not provoke his insecurities or ignite his temper. She was gentle in a way that soothed him, perceptive in a way that steadied him, and quiet in a way that made him believe he had finally found peace. Her legacy rests also in the subtlety of her ascent. Born into a modest gentry family, Jane rose not through brilliance or boldness, not through political fire or religious fervour, but through a softness that masked a steel-edged understanding of courtly life. She knew when to speak, when to bend, when to disappear into stillness, and when to step forward with just enough courage to shape her destiny. Beneath her demure surface lay a woman capable of sensing danger, of navigating ambition, and of guiding the volatile heart of a king without ever seeming to guide at all. Had Jane lived longer, had she remained queen as Henry aged, grew ill, became more unpredictable, would their marriage have stayed peaceful? Would she have retained her gentle influence? Would Henry, a man so quick to turn against those closest to him, eventually have tired of even her quiet ways? No one can say. The path of their future was cut short before time could reveal its sharper edges. Perhaps that is precisely why Jane remains, in Henry's memory and in the echo of Tudor history, a perfect figure preserved in stillness. She did not live long enough to fall from grace, to argue with him, to disappoint him, or to face the storms that consumed so many others. Her death froze her image in a moment of triumph, the mother of a prince, the healer of a fractured family, the gentle queen who brought Henry a sense of calm he rarely felt. In the quiet halls of Windsor, where her effigy rests beside Henry's own, Jane exists forever in that narrow space between life and legend, untouched by time, untouched by bitterness, untouched by the unravelling of years. A queen of brief reign, soft voice, and steady purpose, remembered not for how long she lived, but for how deeply her short life shaped the history of a kingdom. After the death of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII went on to marry 3 more women, yet none of them ever reached or even approached the space Jane had once held in his life. None of them produced a legitimate male heir. None of them restored peace to his household. None of them, in the end, were granted the honour of lying beside him in death. And none of them ever made Henry feel that rare, fragile sense of being understood with the quiet gentleness Jane had once offered. For Henry, Jane became more than a memory. She became an echo of his mother, Elizabeth of York, the calm queen whose softness shaped his earliest years before her death left him adrift. The parallel was irresistible to him. Jane possessed that same tranquility, that same unthreatening warmth, that same ability to soothe the anxieties of a man raised in the shadow of a fragile dynasty. In Jane, Henry saw the reflection of a childhood security he had never found again. And in Jane, He believed he had finally touched the image of the ideal wife he had been searching for since boyhood. Gentle, compliant, warm, calm, and devoted entirely to the king's needs. As Henry aged, grew heavier, sicker, and more paranoid, this memory hardened into something close to myth. The three queens who came after Jane lived beside a man increasingly burdened by chronic pain, infected wounds, failing health, and deep suspicion. They saw the darkest version of Henry, the version Jane never had to face. None of them could undo what the years had carved into him, and none of them could compete with the memory of a woman whose story ended before time could distort it. Thus, when Henry wrote his final wishes, he did not choose to lie beside Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had been his companion for more than 20 years. He did not choose Anne Boleyn, the woman whose brilliance had changed the course of English history. He did not choose Catherine Howard, or Anne of Cleves, or Catherine Parr. He chose Jane, the woman who had walked with him for the shortest time, yet left the deepest, quietest mark. He ordered that when he died, he would rest beside her at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, and that command, unlike so many others shaped by rage or impulse, remained unchanged until his final breath. When Henry died on the 28th day of January, in the year 1547, he was placed exactly where he had demanded, beside Jane, the only wife he wanted to accompany him into eternity. And so the story of Jane Seymour, the softest, quietest, least confrontational of Henry's 6 wives, became the story that echoed farthest. Not because she fought, not because she dazzled, not because she rebelled or reshaped kingdoms, but because she slipped into the heart of a king at the exact moment when he was most vulnerable, and because her life ended before conflict could rewrite the tenderness he felt for her. Jane's impact did not come from thunder or brilliance. It came from stillness, a kind of stillness that Henry, for all his power and all his storms, never learned to find within himself. She became the candle that burned quickly, but brightly, illuminating a path that others could not follow. She became the brief note in a long, chaotic symphony, yet the one that lingered longest in the memory of the man who conducted it. She became the gentle hand that soothed a king haunted by his own failures, the quiet presence that reassured a dynasty shaking under its own weight. A short life, a soft life, but a life powerful enough to alter the fate of a royal line. Henry's reign would be remembered for fire, upheaval, destruction, and 6 marriages. Yet when history peels away the noise, when the shouts fade and the battles calm, it is Jane, the most silent of them all, whose memory lies beside him, and whose influence shaped the survival of the Tudor throne. A candle that burned fast, but shone white. A single note, short in length, but impossibly long in echo. A life brief in years, but deep enough to change a kingdom's course forever. Jane Seymour was born at Wolf Hall, a place whose name suggested quiet fields and distant woods, yet whose walls held the intersecting currents of ambition, tradition, and a silence heavy enough to reshape destinies. She was the daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, a family belonging to the provincial gentry, not royal, not dazzlingly powerful, but respectable enough to drift close to the orbit of the Tudor court without ever touching its molten centre. Jane was not strikingly beautiful. She was not intellectually formidable like Catherine of Aragon, nor bold, captivating, and fashion-forward like Anne Boleyn. Jane received little formal education. She could read, and she could sign her name, but not much more, yet she excelled in everything a household queen was expected to master. Her needlework was exquisite, her manners precise, her presence calming, her instinct for silence uncanny. She knew how to soften a room, how to appear modest without disappearing, how to be present without overwhelming. These were not celebrated talents, but Henry, after 2 turbulent marriages, found himself craving exactly those qualities, with a desperation sharpened by years of chaos. Jane grew up in a large family of 10 surviving children, though 4 siblings died young, most likely victims of the sweeping illnesses of the early 16th century. Her 2 brothers, Edward and Thomas, would later rise to enormous influence under the reign of Edward VI, but it was Jane who laid the foundation for that ascent. Long before her family held high office, she was taught the lessons expected of a gentlewoman: obedience, subtlety, patience, and the art of stepping forward only when the moment was ripe and the audience was weary of louder voices. She was raised to believe that a woman did not need to shine, she needed to be timely. Not brilliant but soothing, not forceful but steady. and she absorbed these lessons so deeply that they shaped every gesture, every choice, every breath. Thus, when Henry VIII began to tire of Anne Boleyn, when their marriage buckled under arguments, exhaustion, and the repeated grief of lost pregnancies, Jane's quietness became a rarity in a court suffocated by smoke and noise. While Anne's wit cut sharp lines through every chamber, Jane's silence settled over the same rooms like a soft layer of snow. While Anne argued, Jane listened. While Anne demanded, Jane waited. While Anne stood ablaze, Jane became the calm pool reflecting the fire but never feeding it. Henry, who had spent years moving from exhilaration to fury, from passion to disappointment, looked at Jane and felt, perhaps for the first time in a very long while, something like rest. She seemed untouched by courtly scheming, untouched by the ambition that pulsed through the palace corridors, untouched even by the frantic energy of a dynasty, still young and unsure of its future. Jane was the pause after a storm, the breath drawn before the next command, the gentle moment he had not realized he needed until her presence gave it shape. To Henry, battered by emotional turmoil and political pressure, Jane did not simply appear gentle, she appeared necessary. A necessary softness, a necessary contrast, a necessary escape. She was the one thing he could not find in Catherine's steadfast intellect or Anne's brilliant fire. Quiet. And quiet, in the fracturing Tudor court, felt like salvation. Jane did not try to dazzle him. She did not flirt boldly or debate fiercely. She did not challenge him, provoke him, or demand from him. And in that absence of noise, Henry felt a balm he could not articulate. He had spent years chasing a certain kind of woman, yet none of them soothed the oldest wound inside him. The wound left by the death of his mother, Elizabeth of York, when he was only 11 years old. Jane's calmness mirrored the memory of that maternal gentleness more closely than any queen before her. So when Anne's star began to dip, when the tides of the court turned cold, Jane's quiet light grew warmer in Henry's eyes. Every whispered courtesy, every bowed head, every soft reply fed the king's increasingly desperate longing for peace. And Jane, raised to understand that stillness could hold power, walked with careful steps into the widening space his dissatisfaction created. She became, without raising her voice, without lifting her hand, the moment of silence after the storm. The place where a tired king could, just for a breath, feel the world stop spinning. Jane entered the Tudor court in the quietest way possible. First as a maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon, and later as one of the ladies serving Anne Boleyn. It was during these years, the years when she moved silently through chambers filled with tension, triumph, jealousy, and heartbreak, that Jane began to shape what would one day become her queenly mind. Not through speeches, not through strategy meetings, but through watching. Catherine taught her the first lessons. Catherine showed her what patience looked like, how dignity could be held even when the world stripped titles away, how a queen bore suffering without letting her voice tremble. Catherine embodied devotion to her husband, to her faith, to her daughter, even when that devotion was rewarded with isolation. Jane saw all of it. She saw the tenderness, the resilience, the quiet agony of a woman displaced after more than 2 decades on the throne. And from Catherine, Jane learned that kindness mattered, but kindness alone could not protect a woman in a court built by men. Anne Boleyn taught her the second set of lessons. Anne's brilliance filled every corridor. Her wit was sharp enough to slice reputations in half, her charm bright enough to dazzle ambassadors and kings. But Anne's light came with its own shadows. Ambition, rivalry, risk, and the peril that came when a woman reached too high in a world that punished women for reaching at all. Jane watched Anne rise dazzlingly, dangerously, and she watched the cracks that began to form beneath her feet. She saw how Anne argued, how she provoked, how she refused to bow, and she saw how quickly a crown could turn into a blade. Jane did not comment. She did not gossip. She did not confide in anyone. She stored every lesson quietly, the way a careful seamstress stores needles, hidden, sharp, and ready. She understood Catherine's wounds. She understood Anne's ascent. She understood Anne's downfall. And slowly, Jane distilled these observations into 3 simple, ironclad rules. Rules she held deep within herself like a whispered prayer. First, speak only when silence is more dangerous. Silence, Jane understood, was as powerful as any weapon when used correctly. Second, let Henry chase. Let Henry desire. Let Henry believe. A queen who pursued the king risked being discarded. A queen who made the king pursue her gained his devotion. Third, appear pure beyond reproach, so spotless that even enemies could find no seam to tug open. Reputation, Jane realized, was not decoration, it was armor. So when Henry visited Wolf Hall in the autumn of the year 1535, Jane was not the naive, timid girl some believed her to be. She was prepared not with Anne's fire, not with Catherine's sorrow, but with her own quiet blueprint for survival. She knew exactly what she was not. She was not bold, not provocative, not political in the open way Anne had been. And she knew exactly what she could be. Jane could be the opposite. Where Anne spoke in quick, glittering words, Jane used pauses. Where Anne insisted, Jane suggested. Where Anne burned, Jane cooled. Where Anne provoked, Jane soothed. And the irony, the soft, devastating irony that history never lets us forget, is this. Jane Seymour caught Henry's heart precisely because she was everything Anne was not. Henry, exhausted by conflict and craving the calm he had not felt since childhood, saw Jane's quiet presence and mistook it for salvation. The court saw it too, especially the factions that longed to bring Anne down. They recognized in Jane not only gentleness but opportunity. A woman who said little could be shaped. A woman who avoided confrontation could be maneuvered. A woman who maintained virtue with such careful precision could topple a queen without ever lifting her voice. Yet beneath all the softness, beneath the bowed head and modest words, Jane held firm to the rules she had carved from years of watching. She would not flirt recklessly. She would not accept money from the king. She would not give him anything, not a touch, not a kiss, not a promise unless he offered marriage. And Henry, drawn into her stillness like a man stepping into shade after standing too long in the sun, followed exactly where she led. Jane had learned well, and for the first time, the king who had broken so many lives without looking back began to move, slowly, inevitably, toward the woman who understood the power of quiet better than anyone else in the palace. Henry VIII had seen Jane Seymour many times before, the year 1535, but only when his marriage to Anne began to splinter like cracked glass did he truly look at her. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the way a weary man notices a quiet corner of a room only after the noise has exhausted him. Anne argued too fiercely. Anne carried too many enemies in her shadow. Anne conceived and miscarried, again and again. Anne confronted Henry in ways that scorched him, reminding him of every failure, every fear, every heir he did not yet have. And in the middle of all that fire, Jane appeared soft as a breath against a window pane. She did not argue. She did not demand. She did not reach beyond propriety. She did not flirt too boldly. She did not step too close. Jane told Henry, in a voice quiet enough to force him to lean nearer, that she could never become a mistress. A single sentence, gentle, firm, and devastatingly precise, struck at the core of Henry's pride and longing. It was not rejection, it was a promise, held behind a locked door, for which he alone could hold the key. And Henry, already worn down by Anne's sharpness and by the endless storms of court politics, felt something inside him loosen. Men like Henry, powerful, suspicious, accustomed to resistance, could be undone by softness. Quiet obedience offered something he had not felt since childhood: safety, predictability, peace. So he began to pursue Jane in earnest. He wrote letters, careful, warm, seeking. He sent small tokens, jewels at first, then gold, then more personal gifts. He offered glances across crowded rooms, longer each time, asking questions without speaking. Jane responded with a balance so delicate it could have been spun of silk. She smiled, but not too warmly. She accepted attention, but not intimacy. She allowed the court to whisper, but never loudly enough for scandal. And when Henry finally sent her a purse filled with coins, the unmistakable symbol of a king taking a woman for his own, Jane made her most calculated move. She returned it. She fell to her knees, hands trembling just enough to appear earnest rather than practiced, and told him she could not accept the gift, except on the day when God allowed her to marry, lawfully, she whispered the husband destined for her. It was a masterstroke. For Henry, caught between pride and hunger, it was irresistible. A woman refusing the king, not with arrogance but with virtue, was a rarity. It made him feel like a righteous man again, a man chosen by God, a man capable of inspiring purity rather than corruption. And from that moment forward, something shifted in him. Jane became the embodiment of everything he believed Anne was not. Where Anne fought, Jane yielded. Where Anne dazzled, Jane softened. Where Anne questioned, Jane agreed. Where Anne stood tall, Jane bowed her head just slightly. Never enough to appear weak, but enough to make Henry feel strong. By the winter of the year 1535, Henry was already imagining a life with Jane, even though Anne remained his queen-in-law. He began to meet Jane more often, arranging moments where she would be near him in corridors, in gardens, in small chambers, where embroidered cushions and wool tapestries softened the edges of long conversations. And Jane, following the guidance of her ambitious brothers Edward and Thomas, kept every rule she had ever learned. She held back emotion, affection, and closeness, like a precious dowry she would not release until the vows were spoken. She never allowed Henry to forget that she was untouched not only physically, but symbolically, spiritually untouched. And in a court where every rumour was a blade, that purity became her shield. Henry fell deeper. Anne grew more strained. The council grew more restless. The ambassadors noted the shift. Whispers curled around the columns of Whitehall like smoke. And though no one dared speak it aloud, everyone knew. Henry had already chosen Jane, even while Anne Boleyn still wore the crown. Early in the year 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, slipping quietly out of a world that had never allowed her peace. Only a few days later, Anne Boleyn miscarried a child believed to be a boy, the very hope she needed to hold her place. The loss struck Henry like a blow to the chest. It was disappointment, humiliation, fear, and fury, wrapped together in a way that left the entire court walking on shattered glass. Whispers spread through the galleries of Whitehall and the stone halls of Greenwich like a drifting fog, a bad omen, a sign from heaven, a warning to the king. The air grew heavy, and Henry's temper sharpened. In the middle of that tense, trembling world, Jane Seymour became something like a refuge, a room without echoes, a place where Henry's voice never rose, where nothing was demanded of him. With Jane, there were no arguments, no pointed questions, no raised eyebrows, only soft replies and the sense that she listened without judgment. Henry began stopping by daily, as if drawn toward her quiet presence by instinct alone. And while he visited Jane, the enemies of Anne watched. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of political storms, the conservative faction that still longed for Catholic order, the nobles who resented Anne's rise, and the diplomats who wished to mend ties with the Holy Roman Empire, all of them recognized the moment they had been waiting for. The king was wounded, the queen was weakened, and Jane Seymour, gentle as she appeared, stood perfectly placed to become the symbol of a new beginning. So the machinery began to turn. Accusations were whispered first, then spoken, then recorded. Anne had lovers, they said. She had seduced musicians, courtiers, even her own brother, George Boleyn. She plotted against the king. She conspired to kill him. She practiced treason. No one with sense believed these charges. Not then, not now. But the Tudor court did not need truth. It needed justification. Henry's grief mixed with frustration, and frustration mixed with desire for order, and desire for order mixed with the promise of a calmer queen beside him. One accusation became three became five, and by the time Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the path had already been paved. On the morning of the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, beneath a grey sky that refused to brighten, Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold. Her executioner, a swordsman brought from Calais, raised his blade. The Queen, who had changed England, who had risked everything, who had burned so brightly it frightened half the kingdom, died in one clean stroke. At that exact hour, Henry VIII was out hunting. No mourning clothes, no silence, no prayer for the woman who had once been the centre of his world. He waited only for the words, "Anne is dead." I was dumb, and when they came, he boarded a barge and travelled down the Thames directly to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, as if history itself had been ordered to move at his pace, Henry and Jane were married. There was no long courtship, no hesitation, no room for reflection. The king was determined to erase the storm and replace it with calm, to bury the flame of Anne with the quiet presence of Jane. To Henry, it was not cruelty, it was necessity, a closing of one chapter, swift and final, so that a new one could begin. And to Jane, who had played her role with precision, restraint, and unwavering softness, it was the moment she stepped fully into the place Anne had vacated, without once looking back. Jane Seymour was not the most powerful queen, not the most beautiful, not the most educated, not the longest living, and yet she became the woman who altered the course of Henry VIII's life more quietly, more deeply, than any of the 5 others who shared his throne. She was the woman who softened him, a feat no one believed possible. She was the woman who gave him the only legitimate son who survived to adulthood. She was the woman who coaxed Princess Mary back into her father's fragile affection. She was the woman whose memory lingered in Henry's mind long after her brief life ended. Jane's story is the story of gentleness, but not a weak or passive gentleness. It was a deliberate gentleness, shaped like a shield, a gentleness that could survive tempests without ever appearing to fight them, a gentleness so controlled, so steady, that it became its own kind of strength. But it is also the story of a cruel destiny, the kind that history repeats with a quiet inevitability. For just when Jane gained everything: a crown, a kingdom's admiration, the child that secured the Tudor line, she slipped away from the world, leaving behind a silence Henry VIII would never fill again. Her triumph and her tragedy were inseparable, woven together like 2 threads in a tapestry she never lived long enough to complete. Henry, who changed wives as quickly as he changed allegiances, treated Jane's memory differently. He spoke of her as his only true wife. He called her the one woman he had ever truly loved. Words unstable men often say, but words that, in Jane's case, held a strange, enduring truth. And when Henry VIII arranged his burial, a king obsessed with legacy, with order, with the symbolism of every stone and every title, he did not choose Catherine of Aragon, the noble first wife. He did not choose Anne Boleyn, the brilliant second wife who cost him so much and gave him so much. He did not choose Catherine Howard, the tragic girl queen, nor Catherine Parr, the woman who nursed him through his final years. He chose Jane, the woman who had been queen for less than 2 years, the woman whose portrait he kept near him long after her death, the woman whose name he spoke with, a softness rarely heard from him, the woman who, in dying, became flawless in his memory. In the long tapestry of the Tudor dynasty, woven with ambition, violence, betrayal, and fear, Jane Seymour's thread is the quietest, and yet the one that glows the longest. Her gentle presence becomes the breath between storms, the soft pause between one tragedy and the next. And that is why her story is always told with a particular tenderness, a delicate sorrow that feels like the sigh that slips out at the end of a late-night tale, a sadness that is not sharp, but lingering, not loud, but deep, not bitter, but impossibly soft. A queen who changed a dynasty not through force, or brilliance, or defiance, but through a calm so rare that even a king like Henry VIII could feel safe inside it. Jane Seymour, the quiet flame, the brief light, the soft note that stays long after the music fades.